The rain fell on New Haven with a soft, persistent hiss, the kind that didn't soak you all at once but seeped in, chilling you to the bone until you forgot what it was like to be dry. Marco Moretti stood as still as the headstone surrounding him, a monolith of black wool and silent grief in a city of the dead. Each drop that traced a cold pad down his temple, past the rigid line of his jaw, felt like a tear the rest of him was too hardened, too broken, to shed. Before him, the raw, wounded earth cradled a polished casket containing the only person who had ever truly seen him, Alexander Rossi. Alex, his best friend, his brother. The hole in the ground was a gash in the world, and Marco felt the void of it in his own chest, a hollowed-out space where laughter and loyalty used to live. He was not alone in his vigil. A few paces back, under the shelter of a massive black umbrella held by a stone-faced associate, stood Don Vittorio. The old man's presence was a testament to Alex's standing, a dangerous honor that now felt like a grotesque parody. The Don didn't move, didn't speak, his own grief a private, imposing thing. The silence between them was a language all its own, punctuated only by the rain's whisper and the distant, muted growl of the city. Finally, the Don stepped forward, his Italian leather shoes sinking soundlessly into the sodden grass. He didn't look at the grave, but at Marco, his eyes like chips of flint in a face of weathered leather. The men who did this, the Don's voice was low, a gravelly rumble that carried more authority than a shout, are still out there. They are dogs, smelling blood. They might come for the sister. Marco's breath hitched, a nearly imperceptible tightening in his shoulders. Sophia, Alex's sunshine, his sacred charge. She knows nothing, the Don continued, his gaze boring into Marco, seeing the guilt that was eating him alive. She believes her brother was a successful import-export consultant. Let her keep that piece of him. You were his brother in all but blood. This falls to you. He placed a heavy, deliberate hand on Marco's shoulder. The weight was an anvil, a sentence. You are her shadow now. Keep her safe. Keep her in the dark. The directive was given. The Don turned and was gone, his silhouette swallowed by the gray veil of rain, leaving Marco alone with the ghost of his failure and the crushing weight of a promise made over a coffin. And so, Marco became a ghost. For 2 weeks, he was a phantom haunting the edges of Sophia Rossi's life. His world narrowed to the dim interior of a nondescript van and a rented room across from her apartment, the air thick with the smell of cold coffee and stale regret. His surveillance setup was a spider's web of technology and intuition. High-resolution photographs were pinned to a corkboard, Sophia leaving her landscape architecture firm, a smile on her face as she hugged a colleague, Sophia laughing with friends at a sidewalk cafe, her head thrown back in a joy that felt like a physical blow to Marco's heart. Sophia shopping for groceries, carefully selecting a single apple, a portrait of poignant, ordinary solitude. He watched her live, this vibrant, innocent woman, and every moment of her normalcy was a fresh indictment of his own world, a world that had devoured her brother and now threatened to consume her too. He was her silent guardian, her unseen sentinel, tormented by the life he was tasked with preserving, a life that was a constant, aching reminder of the one he had failed to save. The breach came on a Tuesday. The rain had returned, glazing the city in a slick, neon-smeared sheen. Marco, his eyes burning from a 16-hour watch, saw them. 2 men. Their posture was all wrong, too still, their attention fixed not on the flow of the city, but on the entrance to Sophia's apartment building. He recognized the taller one, a lean, predatory figure named Silas with a reputation for cruel efficiency. They were associates of the Kovac crew, the rival faction responsible for the ambush that had killed Alex. Marco's blood went from tire to ice in a single, heart-stopping second. The theoretical threat was now a concrete, immediate danger. The time for watching was over. He moved with a predator's grace, exiting the van and blending into the shadows of the parking garage adjacent to her building. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and exhaust fumes. He heard the scuff of their shoes before he saw them, converging near the elevator bank where Sophia would emerge. He could feel the weight of the gun, a cold, familiar comfort against his ribs. His mind, usually a quiet place, was a roaring static of focused intent. Protect Sophia. Atonement. The only words that mattered. The elevator dinged, a cheerful sound that was horribly out of place. Sophia stepped out, her arms full of a drafting tube and a grocery bag, her head down against the damp chill. She never saw the two men closing in, their intentions clear in their stalking gait. Marco did. He erupted from the shadows, a specter made flesh. It was not a fight. It was a brutal, clinical dismantling. A sharp, precise blow to the first man's throat silenced him with a choked gurgle. A spin, a disarm, a sickening crack as he drove the second man's head against the concrete pillar. It was over in less than 10 seconds, a display of terrifying efficiency that left two bodies crumpled on the oil-stained floor. Sophia stood frozen, her groceries spilled at her feet, a carton of milk pooling around her shoes. Her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it seemed to swallow her whole. They darted from the fallen men to the figure who had materialized from the darkness. Marco closed the distance, his own breathing barely elevated. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not harsh. "Sophia, we have to go. Now." Her gaze focused on his face, the shock receding for a single, clarifying moment. Recognition dawned, a fragile, hopeful thing in the midst of the nightmare. "Marco." Her voice was a trembling whisper. Then, the question he had been dreading, the question that was a knife to his soul. "What's going on? Where's Alex?" He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and in his eyes, in the depths of the grief, the guilt, the grim, unyielding resolve, she saw the truth. The answer to both her questions was written in the stark, painful lines of his face. The hope in her eyes shattered, replaced by a devastation that was far worse than her fear. The world she knew was gone, and the man holding her arm was the only tether she had left to the drive was a silent, frantic blur, a nightmare scored by the relentless swish of the windshield wipers and the hammering of Sophia's own heart. She sat rigid in the passenger seat, her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists in her lap, staring at the rain-streaked window without seeing the city as it melted away into anonymous suburbs. The scent of him, a mix of clean rain, leather, and the faint, metallic tang she now understood was blood, filled the car. It was the scent of violence, the scent of the world that had taken her brother. Marco drove with a terrifying, preternatural calm, his eyes constantly scanning mirrors, his movements economical and precise. He was a stranger, the brooding, handsome friend from her memories, the one who had shared laughter and meals in her brother's bright apartment, had been a carefully constructed facade. This man, this grim, silent operator, was the reality. The safe house was a monument to anonymity, a bland, beige box nestled in a row of identical beige boxes on a quiet, tree-lined street where nothing ever happened. Inside, it was sterile and soulless. The furniture was functional, chosen for durability over comfort. The blinds were perpetually half-drawn, casting the living room in a perpetual, gloomy twilight. The only personal touch was a layer of fine dust on the generic landscape prints bolted to the walls. Marco locked the door behind him, the series of deadbolts sliding home with a series of heavy, final thuds that sounded like a prison sentence. He did a quick, silent circuit of the rooms, checking windows, a ritual that was clearly second nature. He finally stopped in the center of the living room, his broad shoulders tense beneath his dark jacket. He wouldn't look at her directly. "You should sit," he said, his voice rough and used. Sophia didn't move. She stood rooted to the spot, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her wet coat clinging to her. "Tell me." The two words were scraped raw from her throat. And so he laid out the sanitized version of the truth, the one the Don had sanctioned. His words were clipped, devoid of emotion, as if he were delivering a field report. Alex was involved with dangerous people. It wasn't import, export. There was a deal. It went wrong. He was gone. The same people who killed him now believed she possessed something, some piece of information he might have left with her. They would not stop looking. The words landed like physical blows. The image of her brother, her charming, larger-than-life brother who loved bad action movies and could burn water while trying to make pasta, shattered or reformed into this terrifying stranger, a man who dealt with killers. The grief, which had been a sharp, immediate stab, now became a vast, cold ocean of betrayal and loss, pulling her under. She sank onto the stiff, synthetic fabric of the couch, the strength gone from her legs. She didn't cry. The tears were frozen somewhere deep inside, trapped behind a wall of shock. The days that followed were a slow, agonizing crawl in the beige cage. The forced proximity was a pressure cooker. Marco was a ghost in the space, a constant, silent presence. He moved through the rooms with Predator's quiet grace, always aware, always watching. He cooked simple, nutritious meals, placing a plate in front of her without a word before taking his own to a different room. He was her warden, her protector, a monument to stoic professionalism. His silence felt like a wall, impenetrable and cold, and she found herself cycling through a maelstrom of emotions, grief for the brother she thought she knew, anger at this man for being the bearer of this horrible truth, and a deep, gnawing fear of the unseen world that now hunted her. But Sophia was not a simple woman. She was a designer, trained to observe, to see the details that others missed. And in the oppressive silence, she began to read Marco like one of her blueprints. She noticed the way his body went preternaturally still at the sound of a car door slamming too close outside, the way his hand would drift unconsciously to the small of his back where the gun was always nestled. She saw the deep, permanent sadness in his dark eyes where he thought she wasn't looking, a well of pain so profound it seemed to dim the very light in the room. And she remembered. She remembered the younger Marco, the one who had visited with Alex, whose rare, genuine smiles had made her teenage heart flutter. That old, hidden crush, a secret she carried for years, began to resurface, a tiny, fragile flame trying to ignite in the howling wind of their circumstances. The first crack in his armor came during a violent thunderstorm that shook the small house. The sky tore open with a cannon's roar of thunder, so sudden and immense it felt like the world was splitting apart. Sophia, lost in a fitful doze on the couch, jolted upright with a sharp cry, her heart leaping into her throat. In an instant, Marco was there. He had crossed the room in a blur, his professional distance vaporized by pure, instinctual reaction. His arms were around her, pulling her against the solid, unyielding wall of his chest. For one suspended moment, there was no past, no dead brothers, no Mafia wars. There was only the terrifying crash of the storm outside and the shocking, profound safety of his embrace. She could feel the powerful beat of his heart against her cheek, a frantic rhythm that matched her own. She felt him tense, his entire body rigid, and then, just as quickly, he was pushing her away, his face a mask of conflicted agony. He took a large step back, his breath coming in a short, sharp gust. "I'm sorry," he muttered, the words thick with self-recrimination. "I shouldn't have." He retreated to the kitchen, leaving her alone on the couch, the air in the room humming with a tension far more electric than the fading storm. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The air in the safe house never truly settled after the storm. The physical tempest had passed, but the emotional one had just begun, leaving a new, charged atmosphere in its wake. The careful, sterile distance Marco had so rigorously maintained was now contaminated with the memory of that single, searing moment of contact. Sophia found she could still feel the phantom imprint of his arms, the solid warmth of his chest, a sensation that was both a comfort and a torment. He, in turn, became a study in controlled chaos. His movements were more rigid, his silence more pronounced, as if he were punishing himself for the lapse, for allowing the men to overshadow the mission. He avoided her gaze, his eyes skittering away whenever she entered a room, focusing instead on the perimeter checks, the weapon maintenance, anything that reinforced his role as her guardian and not him incapable of human weakness. This new tension, however, proved to be a catalyst. The wall of silence, now fractured, could no longer hold back the flood of questions brewing inside Sophia. Her grief was slowly morphing, shifting from a nebulous cloud of shock into a sharp, focused need to understand. One evening, as he methodically cleaned his gun at the small kitchen table, a ritual that both fascinated and horrified her, she broke the silence that had stretched for hours. "What was he really like?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear in the dim room. "With you." Marco's hand still for a fraction of a second, the cloth poised over the gleaming metal. He didn't look up. "He was your brother. Sophia, you knew him." "I knew the version he built for me," she countered, her tone not accusatory, but resolute. "The one who told me he was a consultant. I want to know the one you knew, the one you called your brother." A long, heavy silence followed. She thought he would retreat, would shut down completely. But then, with a slow, weary exhalation, he began to speak. His voice was low, the words coming reluctantly at first, then with a growing, painful reverence. He didn't talk about violence or power. He spoke of Alex's terrible poker face, the way he'd bluff with a king-high hand and lose his entire paycheck. He shared a story of them, as foolish teenagers, trying to fix a leaky boat on a freezing Long Island Sound, ending up in the water and laughing until they couldn't breathe. He painted a picture of men of immense, foolish loyalty, who once took a beating for a friend who couldn't pay his debts. With each small, fond story, Marco was giving her pieces of her brother back, not the sanitized myth, but the flawed, real, and fiercely loyal man he had loved. And in doing so, he was unknowingly giving her pieces of himself, revealing capacity for deep, abiding love that existed beneath the enforcer's cold exterior. This shared excavation of a lost life forged a new, fragile connection between them. The safe house was no longer just a prison. It became a confessional. Late one night, unable to sleep, they found themselves sitting in a dark living room, illuminated only by the faint orange glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. The darkness made it easier to speak the truths that were too raw for the light of day. "I feel so lost," Sophia whispered into the gloom, her voice thick with unshed tears. "It's like the foundation of my entire life was made of sand, and it's all just washed away. I don't know what's real anymore." Marco was silent for so long she thought he hadn't heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was a raw, shattered thing, stripped bare of all its defenses. I was supposed to have his back. The confession hung in the air, heavy with a guilt so profound it was almost a physical presence in the room. "That night, I wasn't there. I was on another assignment, something stupid. If I had been protecting you," he paused, swallowing hard. "It's the only thing I can do for him now. It's the only atonement I have left." This shared vulnerability was the final, definitive spark. The last of the barriers, constructed from duty, guilt, and grief, crumbled to dust in that dark, quiet room. The space between them on the couch, which had once felt like a mile, now felt like an impossible chasm. The attraction, the years of hidden longing, the desperate, human need for solace in a world gone mad, it all converged into a single, undeniable force. When he finally turned to look at her, his eyes were stripped raw, reflecting a mirror of her own desolation and need. There was no first kiss, not in the traditional sense. It was a collision, a desperate, mutual grasping for something real, for a connection that was theirs alone, untainted by the ghosts of the past. Their coming together was not merely about passion. It was a frantic, silent conversation, a shared grief, a desperate attempt to console and be consoled, to feel something other than the crushing weight of loss. It was intense, emotional, a storm of its own making. And in its aftermath, as it lay tangled together in the quiet dark, the world had irrevocably shifted. The protector and the protected were gone. The best friend sister was gone. All that remained were two survivors, clinging to each other in the wreckage, reeling from the terrifying, beautiful truth of what they had just begun. Dawn broke, not with brilliant sunrise, but with a slow, gray seep of light through the slatted blinds, illuminating the safe house in all its stark, beige reality. The new day did not bring clarity. It brought a complicated, heavy silence. The air, which hours before had been electric with passion and raw vulnerability, was now thick with the aftermath. Marco was already awake, standing at the window with his back to her, his posture rigid, a silhouette of renewed tension. The space where his body had warmed hers now felt cold and empty. He had retreated, not just physically, but emotionally, rebuilding the walls with a frantic, desperate speed. When he finally turned, his face was a carefully schooled mask of professional detachment, but his eyes, shadowed and haunted, betrayed the war raging within him, a brutal conflict between the ecstasy of the night and the crushing weight of his oath to a dead man. "That was a mistake," he said, his voice rough, the words like stones dropped into the quiet room. He couldn't look at her as he said it, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere on the floor between them. "It can't happen again. It was a moment of weakness. It compromised the mission." The words were a deliberate, cruel armor designed to push her away, to reestablish the boundaries he had so catastrophically crossed. But Sophia was no longer the scared, grieving woman he had whisked away from her apartment. She had seen the man beneath the armor, felt his heartbeat against hers, heard the raw truth in his voice. His rejection now felt not like a professional assessment, but profound personal betrayal. A hot flush of anger rose in her cheeks, burning away the last vestiges of her shock. She stood, pulling the sheet around her, her chin lifting with a defiance that seemed to startle him. "Don't," she said, her voice low and shaking with emotion. "Don't you dare cheapen this. Don't you dare call what happened in that room a mistake or weakness. I am not a complication to your mission. Marco, I am a part of it now, whether you like it or not." The confrontation hung between them, a new, different kind of danger. He turned away, a muscle ticking in his jaw, and buried himself in the mechanics of security, checking and rechecking the perimeter, his movements sharp and frustrated. Sophia, meanwhile, her mind sharpened by a potent mix of hurt and resolve, began to actively listen. She listened to the low, terse conversations he had on a burner phone, her designer's mind trained to assemble disparate pieces into a coherent whole, latching onto every fragmented clue. He mentioned a name, Kovac, a place, the ironworks, a detail about a shipment coming in that night he dismissed as unrelated. But to Sophia, it was a key piece of the puzzle. While Marco saw her as something to be protected, she had become a partner, observing from a different angle. Later, as he studied a map of the city, his frustration palpable, she approached him. Her manner was calm, her voice steady. "You said the Kovac crew handles their own dirty work, right? That they're prideful." She pointed to the industrial district on the map, her finger landing on the area he'd called the ironworks. "The shipment tonight. It's not a distraction. It's the prize. If they're moving it themselves, and they're as arrogant as you say, then their best enforcers, the ones who came after me, the ones who killed Alex, they'll be there, to make sure it goes smoothly, to prove they aren't afraid." Marco stared at her, a slow dawning of realization in his eyes. He had been looking at the situation through the lens of a soldier, expecting a direct assault. She had looked at it through the lens of a strategist, understanding ego and pattern. Her logic was impeccable. He had missed it. She hadn't. The dynamic between them shifted irrevocably in that moment. She was not just a liability to be guarded. She was an asset, a collaborator. "I'm not just something you need to protect," she said, echoing her words from the morning. "I can help." Using her information, Marco formulated a new, aggressive plan. He would draw them out, use the shipment as bait, and finish the threat against them once and for all. But the Kovac crew was not to be underestimated. They had anticipated a counter-move. As Marco engaged a team of their men in a fierce, chaotic firefight amidst the rusting machinery of the ironworks, using the environment to his advantage with a brutal, efficient grace, a second, smaller team, having flanked his position, moved on the safe house. They had been watching, waiting for him to leave her exposed. Back in the beige prison, Sophia heard the shatter of glass as the back window was forced. Before she could react, a man she didn't recognize, his face a grimace of violent intent, burst into the living room and grabbed her, a thick arm locking around her throat, cutting off her scream. Outside, Marco had just neutralized the last of the initial attackers when he heard the muffled cry from inside. His blood ran cold. He moved toward a house, only to find the final Kovac enforcer, a hulking brute named Silas, stepping from the shadows, a pistol aimed directly at Marco's chest. Marco was cornered, his own weapon not yet raised. Silas smiled, a cruel, triumphant twist of his lips. "The boss sends his regards, Moretti. Says to say hello to your friend in hell." In that frozen, heart-stopping second, Marco saw his failure, his atonement, his entire world about to be extinguished. But then, movement behind the glass door. Sophia, her eyes wide with terror but burning with a fierce will, remembered a stupid, laughing lesson from a lifetime ago. Her brother, Alex, showing her a move, a simple, brutal thumb-of-the-eye jab, joking that she should use it on any boy who got too fresh. With a surge of desperate strength, she drove her thumb hard into the soft tissue of her captor's eye. The man roared in pain and shock, his grip loosening for a single, crucial moment. It was the distraction Marco needed. His body moved before his mind had fully processed it. He dropped into a crouch, sidestepped the line of fire, and in one fluid, violent motion, disarmed Silas, the crack of breaking bone echoing the gunshot that never came. He didn't stop to finish the mun. He was already moving, a force of pure, terrified rage, bursting through the door to find Sophia struggling against her blinded attacker. The world narrowed to a single, red haze point. Protect Sophia. The final, desperate test of his vow had arrived. The silence that descended upon the safe house was a physical thing, thick and heavy with the acrid scent of gunpowder, sweat, and a copper tang of blood. It was a silence that echoed with the recent violence, a stark contrast to the explosive chaos of moments before. Marco stood over the crumpled form of Sophia's attacker, his chest heaving, not from exertion, but from a feral, primal rage that still coursed through his veins. His knuckles were raw, his expression that of a man who had stared into the abyss and had tore it apart with his bare hands. His gaze, wild and desperate, found Sophia. She was leaning against the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps, one hand pressed to her throat where the man's arm had been. In her eyes, he did not see the terror he expected. He saw shock, yes, and a lingering adrenaline, but also a fierce, unyielding resilience. She had not been a passive victim. She had fought. She had created the opening that saved his life. In that shattered room, surrounded by the evidence of the world he belonged to, the last vestiges of his old vow, the one that painted her as a fragile thing to be kept in the dark, crumbled to dust. The official cleanup was a swift, anonymous affair. Men in unmarked vans arrived, their work efficient and silent. The threat was neutralized, the immediate danger passed. They were offered a new location, a different beige box in a different anonymous town. Marco refused with a single, sharp shake of his head. The job was over. The war, for now, was won. But as he looked at Sophia, her face pale but composed, he knew a different journey was just beginning. They drove through the rest of the night and into the dawn, not as protector and protected, but as two survivors, bound by a shared trauma and a connection that had been forged in his fire. They did not speak. Words were too fragile, too inadequate for the seismic shift that had occurred between them. When the city skyline emerged on the horizon, Marco knew where he had to go. He left Sophia at a quiet, secure hotel with a promise that was more a plea in his eyes. I need to do this. I'll be back. He drove to the cemetery, the morning sun now bright and clear, washing the headstones in a light that felt strangely forgiving. He stood once more before Alex's grave, but the man who stood there now was not the same broken soul from weeks before. The guilt was still there, a permanent scar on his heart, but it was no longer a chain. He knelt, his fingers brushing the cold stone. I found a piece of you I can still save, he whispered, his voice steady and clear, carrying on a quiet morning air. And I'm not going to protect it out of guilt anymore. I'm going to love her. I'm going to love her with everything I have, with the whole man I am, not just the shadow I became. That's my promise now. It was not a request for forgiveness, but a declaration, a passing of the torch from a vow to the dead to a vow for the living. He found her where he knew she would be, in Alex's old apartment, now stripped of its life, filled only with boxes of memories. She was sitting on the floor, a photo album open in her lap, tracing the image of her brother's laughing face. She looked up as he entered, and he saw the question in her eyes, the fear that the man from the safe house, the one who had called their night together a mistake, had returned. He didn't approach her with the swagger of a protector or the distance of an enforcer. He walked to her and knelt, putting himself at her level, his eyes holding hers with a vulnerability he had never before allowed himself to show. The job is over, Sophia, he said, his voice soft but unwavering. The threat is gone. My duty, the one I swore to your brother, is fulfilled. He took a slow breath, laying his truth bare before her. But I'm not. If you'll have me, I'm not going anywhere. I love you, not because you're his sister, not because you're my duty, but because you're you. You're the strongest person I've ever known. Let me build a real life with you, a true one. No shadows, no lies. The final image was not a dramatic embrace or a passionate kiss, but of something quieter, more profound, more real. It was a week later, in a sun-drenched apartment that was neither a safe house nor a mausoleum to the past. There were 2 cardboard boxes sitting side by side in the middle of the living room floor, one half full of her books on landscape architecture, the other containing the few simple possessions he owned. They were unpacking them together, merging the fragments of their old lives into the foundation of a new one. It was not a perfect fairy tale ending. The ghosts were still there, the memories still held their pain. But it was a true beginning. They were not hiding from the past. They were building a future upon its ashes, their hands touching as they reached for the same dish to place on a new shelf, a silent, steady promise of a life lived in the light together. Did Marco and Sophia's hard-won peace capture your heart? Their story may be over, but more tales of dangerous love and redemption await. Subscribe now and never miss a new journey into the heart of passion and conflict.